I always feel like there should be music playing when we're waiting for everybody to join.
Yeah, we should be having some really badly chosen, sort of cafeteria music going on in the background. Gerry's big on music. He's chosen something for us.
Okay, well, welcome everybody this evening to this discussion on arts and culture in Scotland after the virus. My name is Simon Barrow. I'm the director of the Ethics, Politics and Beliefs think tank Ecclesia. And of course, I'm the co-editor, along with Gerry Hassan, of the book Scotland After the Virus, which this is based on. A little bit of a visual clue there. I'm just going to give you a couple of announcements about the details of how this evening is going to go before introducing both this evening and our four fabulous panelists and the book itself. First thing to say is that this is being recorded by Luath Press, and that means that your camera and audio has been turned off. And that's not because we don't like the look of you, it's for copyright reasons. The second thing to say is about the format of the evening. We're going to have short contributions from each of our panelists, who I'll introduce in a few moments. And then we're going to open up for discussion and question and answer. And I think the important thing to say there is please do use the chat function. When you come across the idea for a question, do pop it in there. And then when we get to that, I'll try and pick up on those. Might invite some of you to actually ask your question in person to liven it up a little bit. And we'll be taking questions coming from YouTube and Twitter as well, if that's possible. The other thing to say, talking of Twitter and social media, is there is a hashtag for this evening, both during the event and afterwards, and it's hashtag SATVbook. So that's SATVbook. Next thing to say is that we're sorry that there isn't sign language with this event, but when it is put up on the Luath YouTube site, it will be auto-titled, so it'll be fully accessible in that way. And then the last thing to say, which I will remind you about at the end, is that there is a discount available for the book this evening if you go to buy it from the Luath site, and it's SATV Social. So that's, I think, all the announcements to be made. I think just by way of introduction to say that we are all incredibly conscious that we are discussing after the virus, the day after the horrific announcement of 100,000 deaths across Britain. And we are very, very conscious of that and the enormous suffering that people have gone through. And really the question as to what and when after the virus might happen and what it might mean was something that Gerry and I were very conscious of when we were putting the book together. And one of the features of the book, of course, is that the contributors, amongst others, talk about their own personal experiences, and I expect our guests will do this evening as well. The second thing to say, as you will have noticed, is that the book is something of a reflection of the theme for this evening, arts and culture, in that we're delighted to have 9 short stories, 9 poems, as well as material on social and political themes and cultural themes within the book itself. And although most of it's in English, one of the poems is in Gaelic, and we have a couple of contributions of the short stories in the Scots language as well. So we've tried to make the book something that models what we want to achieve, which is a reflection both on the reality of living with the pandemic, but also the hope and possibility as we move forward, which is one of the things that we want to focus on this evening. I think the last comment I'll make is simply to draw your attention to the cover, which has a particular story to it. James Donald, the weaver and artist who's based near where I live, actually in Leith, put this together. What actually happened was that during the first lockdown in March, April, he was looking at ways of, well, surviving artistically, but also how can you be creative at a time of immense difficulty? And so he went out for walks with his small dog Domino, and he asked friends and neighbours and family to nominate colours or textures, and he used his phone camera to take pictures of those colours and those textures, and then he turned them into mood boards, as he called them, which were reproduced as art postcards, and the postcards were sold off to raise money for NHS charities. So it was really an end-to-end kind of operation, extremely creative artistically, but also investing back in the community at a difficult time. And I think that's a kind of wonderful example, both of the difficulty and challenge and the question of hope as well. So I'm now going to introduce our speakers this evening. What we've asked all of them to do is to say a little bit about how they've lived with the pandemic, both personally and professionally, and where they see the situation of arts and culture in Scotland at the moment, and maybe where we're heading, to make an initial few comments about that, and then we hope to open up into a conversation with you about that. So the speakers we'll be having this evening, first of all, we're delighted to have Peter Arnott. Peter is a playwright and author and director and writer of some 50 plays, many of them based and related to Scotland. Then we are also delighted to welcome Flavia Davila. She's a Brazilian-born but Edinburgh-based theatre director and producer. And she has a great chapter in the book. It has the title, Abandon All Hope, All Ye Who Enter Here. But don't worry, it's not just about doom. It has some positive lights to shed as well. And then thirdly, we have Ankna Arokium, who is a singer based in Glasgow, and she's currently pursuing her PhD at the Royal Conservatory of Scotland there. Then our fourth speaker is Joyce Mcmillan. Joyce is well known as a cultural commentator, as a theatre critic, as a political and social columnist for The Scotsman, and also, with a number of others of us, very heavily involved in the National Union of Journalists. Welcome, Joyce. And last but most definitely not least is my esteemed collaborator, Gerry Hassan. Gerry's a research fellow in contemporary history at Dundee University. He's a very well-known commentator, and he's author, editor and contributor to a very large number of books, many of them focusing on Scotland. So welcome to everybody. And I'm going to kick off by asking Peter to share a little bit of his opening thoughts on this theme of arts and culture in Scotland.
Thanks very much, everyone, for having me. I'm kind of shocked going out for a walk every day at how small the world has become, but at how much I've come to treasure the local, but how much easier the local is to treasure when it's got a really nice park in it. And now this makes me reflect that if the ambition of government is that everywhere should be a locality that's as nice to be in as possible, as nice as the one where I live, for example, then that's the well-being, place-based paradigm that we've been hearing more and more about during this pandemic. The aim is very simple. The delivery is extremely complicated, but it sounds like there just might be a place for the arts if we think about it properly. After all, the simple version of what we do, or what I do, or what I usually do, or what I used to do, is getting people together in rooms to work out effective ways of telling stories. And then sometimes the stories of the people in the room, and then invite rather more people into a rather bigger room or a sequence of bigger rooms in order for them to join in too and compare how we got on to their experience of life, the universe, and everything. And that's a very simple aim. But it's been over the years and over more years than this, very complicated to get to. And this is because the arts, like every other public service, has operated for the last 30 years within a paradigm of competitive tendering, which means that if you're locked into a 3-year funding cycle, as most organizations are, you'll spend 18 months out of every 3 years applying for your own job, when usually there's no one else applying for it. Or if you're a freelancer like me, you'll spend at least half your time applying for the means by which to do your own job. Now, there has to be some method of accountability for the expenditure of public funds, of course there does, and that is what, since the 90s, we've chosen. But the pandemic has asked some very urgent questions about that paradigm and whether that's the best one to suit national or local needs for either artists or audiences at the other side of it, whenever that is. And as Flavia observed in her piece, the very generous funding for the arts in the pandemic has been to fund institutions rather than artists. But this is for the very simple reason that governments have kept the same paradigm for the pandemic support as was used before the pandemic, in the hope and expectation perhaps that somebody will flick a switch and everything will go back to normal. But I think the one thing that even a glance through the book would confirm is that normal, which had its limitations, let's be honest, is away in the rearview mirror and gone. There's no going back to what no longer exists. So we return to the here and now, to what we find on the walks that we're all going on, to our localities, to treasuring and enhancing the local. And I would argue that we need a new locally oriented paradigm for the arts, as revolutionary as that which followed World War II and gave us the Arts Councils in the first place. So I suggest we start with very simple aims, and we describe how we want to achieve them, not as competitors for a single tender, but as a collective, a community of artists, a collective of collectives, a community made up of communities. Now, I've got some ideas about how we might do that, and this book's got some ideas about how we might do that, and I welcome your ideas tonight.
Great. Peter, thank you very much. Some really challenging issues in that opening comment. And I'm glad that we're already getting some responses on chat from Andrew Leach and Mary Brown. Do, folks, as thoughts or questions come to you, pop those into the chat. And I'm now going to move on to Flavia. Great to have you with us, Flavia. How are things looking from your point of view?
Hi, Simon. First of all, thank you and Gerry and Lewis for the invitation. And I suppose I should also thank Joyce for recommending me to contribute to the book. And I just want to say that a few days ago, there was a thread in a producers group on Facebook about an article that was in the news recently discussing the potential return of the festivals this summer. And the person who initiated that thread was quite optimistic about it. And she was asking for other people's opinions on the possibility of a return to live performances this year still. And I replied that I was a pessimist by nature. So from the very start of the pandemic, I was already prepared to see this last at least 18 months to 2 years. So I suppose that's where I still am. I'm still in a sort of a bit more of a pessimistic / realistic position in relation to it all. And so, yeah, my essay for Scotland After the Virus, as Simon indicated earlier, is titled after the words said to be inscribed on the gates of hell in Dante Alighieri's Inferno, the first part of the Divina Commedia trilogy. And it's a rant. It's a rant, but it's also a way of reflecting on what I felt was a missed opportunity for theatre in particular to pause and think. And I drew on my experiences as a migrant as well, both pre-COVID, having had my life and my career interrupted and delayed because of things like the hostile environment, and during COVID, having been ineligible for a lot of the support that is available to my peers. So these experiences taught me how to navigate uncertain times and things like financial instability, but also to allow myself the time and space to try and get smarter and produce some of my best work by simply taking it slowly. So one thing that stood out to me throughout the past year was that I was overwhelmed by the online content producing frenzy that the sector went into, which made me actually retreat and wanted to move away from theatre. And I have been quite vocal in my own networks about not being too willing to work with this new medium of online theatre or digi-theatre, though I am keen to discuss that and to experiment with some ideas with no strings attached. And I've also mentioned dozens of movements and task forces and things that got organized during 2020, but how I didn't think that we were going to get any sense out of the leaders in the industry at this point. There's just too much going on, there's too much reaction, and there's not enough reflection, which means that people are sort of bending over backwards to maintain structures that are not working for a lot of people, instead of taking this opportunity to accept that the dismantling of these structures might be a good thing, and it might pave the way to rebuild something different and better. So just to finalize this initial provocation here, just before Christmas, when the libraries were still open, I was at the National Library of Scotland reading an anthology of essays about the Centre for Performance Research, which is based in Wales. And this was a book from 2006. And there was an essay by Rustam Barusha, a professor of theatre and performance studies. And there's this quote in this essay that I thought was wonderful. So it reads, quote, I am not arguing, so this, sorry, for the context, is that he was writing about seeing a venue burning down, how that was sad, but it was also a great opportunity for transformation. So the quote reads, quote, I am not arguing here for the destruction of the means of production in the actual site of performance for theatre to be considered significant. I am not an anarchist, but I do believe that when the theatre burns down, there is something to be learned from this unprecedented event, and that's to return to the practice of theatre with the metaphoric reassurance drawn from its phoenix-like death in life process is to risk lapsing into a kind of regression, if not a time warp. I'll leave it at that to begin with. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and again, much to reflect on there, as well as your personal experience there. Going to move on now to Ankna, and of course she's a singer and musician as well as a student. So again, interesting to hear how you're seeing and experiencing things, Ankna.
Yes, thank you for having me. I have not contributed to the book, but I have read what Flavia's contribution, and I guess this is something that I've been actively thinking about. I thought I'll just share a little bit of my own personal journey through lockdown, and well, I don't know how many lockdowns we've had so far, but just my personal journey through that, and a few thoughts that I've had. So I'm currently writing my PhD and will hopefully be submitting, actually not hopefully, I have to submit later this year or my very Indian dad will probably disown me. At the beginning of the first lockdown, I started baking, which was great. But then I started eating everything that I was baking, which wasn't that great. I think it was just a way of coping with everything that was happening around me. Then finances started dwindling due to work cancellations. So in June, I moved in with friends who had dogs, which was excellent. And while I did struggle to balance between what was happening around me and trying to move forward with my PhD, I did manage to pick up some good habits. It was the first time in a very long time I started thinking about who I am as a person, not just professionally as a musician, but just my own personal identity, because my research focuses on musical, cultural, and social identities of young Indians learning Western classical music, and what does that mean in a post-colonial context in India. I began to look after myself a bit more because pre-COVID, I was very socially active. I was at RCS every single day, meeting people, interacting people, and I would pretty much go back to my flat only to sleep. But then lockdown changed that, and I was forced to spend time with myself. And because I don't like awkward silences and just sitting there in complete silence, not knowing what to do, I actually I picked up good habits. I think I picked up habits, I guess. But I went for walks. I started playing my cello again. I was singing more. I was practicing more. My relationship with music changed much more because I was no longer doing music as a means of supporting myself while I'm studying. I think it took a different turn, and I also managed to climb 3 Munros. Who am I? I don't recognize this person. Professionally, I was able to do a few projects, which include an opera in London as part of Tete a Tete Opera Festival, a funding opportunity that came through St Andrews Voices Festival, where I worked with a tabla player and a pianist to put a concept of a woman's journey through dusk, working through Mirabai's poems, who was a 16th century Indian poet, and also working with Scottish Chamber Orchestra Vibes Project, which is working with young people with different various musical backgrounds. Moving on, I think what COVID has done it has challenged the very foundation of what it defines to be a successful musician or artist. And especially, I think this is going to be a challenge for the music and arts education in Scotland and even beyond, because we need to be thinking about molding successful citizens, not just successful artists, and what true success means. I know we are in a pandemic, and I know political comments have been made. I know we're in a pandemic, and it's just not the arts sector that suffered. But I think for a sector that has suffered severe cuts even before the pandemic, especially when it comes to arts education, I think the government does need to step up and start paying attention. The fact that artists have to keep defending why they need money, keep justifying why we need jobs, why they're viable, whether we are in a pandemic or not, I think is demeaning, disrespectful, demotivating. And personally, I think if we're going to continue walking in this very capitalist path, I think performing arts will not be truly valued, and I think that needs to seriously be considered. And just to kind of echo what Flavia said, I'd also written this down, is that to build a better system, we must deconstruct the existing framework and figure out where is that we're lacking and where is that we're failing in the arts. Until we do that, we won't be able to have a reflective response. But as Flavia said, we're just reacting in real time to create more material. But I wanted to leave this on a positive note. It was a quote by Arundhati Roy. I don't know if you came across this on Twitter recently, but I think it filled me with hope. So I'll just share it with you all. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their worlds anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, our hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, dead rivers, and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
Thank you very much indeed, Ankna. And I mean, to end on that note of personal and social transformation is really powerful as well. Joyce, if I can bring you in next. Obviously you both are engaged with the political and social world and with art and theatre and culture. So we're looking forward to your thoughts. I'm not sure if we have Joyce with us at the moment. We might have a small technical problem. So if I can...
myself. There we go.
Here she is. Excellent.
Yeah, sorry. Well, it really has been a very profound change for anyone who cares about any of the live performing arts over the last year. And, you know, obviously that includes the world of live music, which has a large commercial element, but it also includes the more publicly supported parts of live music, and then it includes art forms like theatre, dance, the spoken word, and particularly in the case of theatre and dance, those have traditionally received more public support. So it's been a very, very profound rupture for everybody who cares about those art forms. And of course, we all know what it is that we miss about the live performing experience, at least those of us who take part in those art forms as audience members or as performers, know what we miss about it, which is the experience of being, it's the same really experience as the one we miss when we talk about not seeing our families, not being able to celebrate special occasions. We miss the experience of being in a room with other people, telling stories, hearing stories, reacting to stories. I think it was Ian Heggie, the Scottish playwright, who once said that theatre was like an act of collective dreaming, where you allow yourselves sitting together in a room to have the same dream about an alternative possible reality. And I do think that is one of the very important functions of theatre, and we miss it tremendously. But at the same time, under the pressure of the pandemic, we found out things about the online world and its capacities that are going to change everything. And the sooner we get our heads around the extent to which it's going to change everything and begin to think of creative and positive ways of responding to that, the better it will be, I think, for the live performing arts in Scotland, in the UK, and everywhere. What we've learned, first of all, is that, and we've learned this not only in the arts, is that encountering people online is very often easier and cheaper than encountering them in the real world. You don't have to travel so far. From an environmental point of view, it's probably not as damaging, although we do have to consider the environmental impacts of the internet itself, but nonetheless. And so you can reach people much more cheaply and much more easily. And we've all learned just how cheap and easy it can be. You know, we have an NUJ branch in Edinburgh, which Simon and I are part of, and because of the pandemic, we're able to hold meetings which can be attended by people who could never make our live meetings. We can have speakers who could never have made the journey, even in pre-COVID times, to talk to us, and we can have people from all over the world really speaking to the branch. And that has improved the quality of those branch meetings, 100%, having to move them online, and it has made them into a very different, much more flexible animal. And the same, to some extent, is true for the performing world. People have found ways of creating live events online. It's not like being in a room with other people, but it's no longer true, for instance, that in all live online events, you can't see the rest of the audience. In some of them, you can. You can even interact live with the event. Any of you who saw the wonderful online panto that Perth Theatre produced at Christmas will know that that's doable. So we've learned that we can do a hell of a lot more online, and that it's often easier, quicker and cheaper to do it online. And we need to take account of that knowledge, which no one now is going to be able to unknow. And then secondly, we've learned the point that Andrew's already referred to in our chat conversation here, which is that it's often much, much more inclusive. You know, from a political point of view, and when it comes to all the questions about exclusion and thresholds and price and all the rest of it, which traditionally exclude people from some of what have traditionally been regarded as the high arts, then having material available online includes people who have always before been excluded by that, whether by poverty, whether by geography, because the arts, as we traditionally understand them, are a very urban thing. They grew up in cities and they depend on cities for their life. Most of them, so big theatres, all of that. So it excludes people by geography, it excludes people by poverty, and it excludes people by disability, and that includes mental health problems, because there are many, many people who find the mere act of going into a big room with other people, even if they can afford it, and even if they can get themselves there, find that extremely intimidating. So we've learned a lot of positive things about the impact of online working on the reach of the live arts, on their flexibility, and particularly on how many people they can really reach. Some of the material that was produced as part of the National Theatre of Scotland's Scenes for Survival programme has reached upwards of 1 million viewers. And those are numbers which are beyond the dreams of theatre and most live arts performers in Scotland. 60 people a night in the Traverse, considered quite good. And then suddenly you realise that the same artists with the same capacities and the same talents are able to produce work that really is of interest and entertainment to this vast audience that probably never before even knew that some of those artists existed. So all of this, in a way, changes everything. I don't think in future the arts will be able to avoid all the issues about access and reach and price and exclusiveness and class, which have traditionally surrounded the arts. Two more tiny points, just one sentence each. One is that while I agree with everything that Peter and the others have said about the need to take this chance to look at things differently, I'm slightly struggling to see where the leadership for that is going to come from. It's not going to come from the arts funding bodies who don't really see that as their role. I don't see it at the moment really coming from any of the artists' associations, whether it's the Federation of Scottish Theatres, the musicians, you know, whose job is it to have that overall strategic view of what should happen to the arts? Doesn't seem to me to be a question that has an easy answer. And it's maybe one that you know, in terms of organisations and people, we should give a bit more thought to. And then finally, there are the big questions about internationalism. Somebody who lives in Edinburgh, I've seen in my lifetime internationalism in the arts absolutely transform the cities of Scotland, particularly Edinburgh and Glasgow, from, you know, dingy provincial places with declining industries or with, you know, lots of government buildings with no government and all the rest of it, into the festival city of Edinburgh as we came to know it, and then Glasgow becoming also an international city of culture. And then we've seen that development move on another stage to the point where the over-tourism and the exploitation of that international platform, and particularly in the case of Edinburgh, has become a subject of really bitter controversy, again, over issues of access and class and who is it all for. But nonetheless, I don't think anyone in Scotland would want to go back to the time when we didn't have those international links, that international platform and those connections. So what does it mean for a city with 5, 6, 7, 8 international festivals like Edinburgh, if suddenly we emerge into a world where people no longer need to travel so much because they've learned how to use the internet, and where we no longer can travel so much because of the constraints of climate change? What does internationalism look like in that era? I'll stop there. Thanks, Simon, and thanks for indulging me a bit on the length.
That's absolutely fine. Thanks very much, Joyce. And I mean, you've raised again a range of big issues: the international question, the how money works in relation to all of this and to inclusion, and the question of class, which is maybe one that we need to talk about a lot more and come back to. So thank you very much for that. And finally, I want to give Gerry Hassan, a co-editor, a chance to come in on that. I mean, the arts are, I know, an important part of Gerry's life, music in particular, and he's taken the opportunity during lockdown, I know, to walk around his own neighbourhood in Glasgow, to notice what's going on, to take pictures of what's going on, and so on. So, Gerry, I wondered if you wanted to make any comments before we open up for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Simon. Thank you to everyone. I just wanted to start in the personal in terms of like a lot of people, I welcomed me at the beginning of all this nearly a year ago, consciously slowed down and noticed things differently. Noticed things in my own area that I've lived nearly 30 years that I hadn't noticed before. I was also living with a dog for the first time ever because a friend came pre-lockdown with their dog. So I was doing dog walking, which is a whole other like community, dogs, people talk to you with a dog. And I took up chess and golf, which I'd played as a youngster, which got all sorts of people saying to me, I didn't think you were a golf type. I didn't think you were a chess type. Then you have to explain to them that in Scotland, these were not necessarily the activities of posh people, that there's a working class golfing tradition in Scotland, for instance, as well. And my final thing I did was, which I'd long been after, was I bought an original map of the British Empire at its peak, because as I tried to explain to people when I was searching for this was not a pro-empire point. It's just the point. It is part of our history. It has defined, mostly for bad, nearly entirely bad, what we are, what we've come through. And because of that, I put this on Facebook. Someone told me the amazing point that the British Empire it's an astounding fact. The British Empire was legally abolished in January the 1st, 1983, when the term colony was taken out of British law. 1983. The Thatcher government abolished the British Empire. So three quick points just because of time. One is Peter's point about funding is fundamental, I think, to devolution. Devolution has tended to fund people and groups and interests that have already been funded generally. And if you look at distributional consequences, that's true. We're going to end up, hopefully, with a bigger state. But if that's going to be true across the world, one of the things we've very rarely investigated in Scotland is what kind of state, whose kind of state it is. And so my other two cultural points to make is the issue of cultural representation and broadcasting. I was watching the BBC series recently, Traces, set in my hometown Dundee. And it concluded at one point with this amazing panoramic view of the city at night, which I froze the TV screen and took a picture of, because to me, it made Dundee seem like a mini Manhattan or somewhere, international and magical. And it brought home the point of how little we see cultural representation of our places on TV, etc. And so my final point is about, which Joyce has touched on much better, much more eloquently, is about corporate culture as culture. And part of me doesn't miss an awful lot of the festivals. Part of me regards quite a lot of the festivals that are about, particularly music festivals, as fake festivals. The capture of the word festival, the grotesque public subsidy of underbelly in Edinburgh that Joyce has touched on. And in that, as well as negatives, there's actually to me been a positive musically, because in the corporate noise being backtracking, lots of other things that you would have missed have emerged. So I found last year one of the most amazing music years I've lived through in my adult life. And that then raises the question of how do we deal with the corporate noise coming back, and how do we fund and sustain those voices that can emerge when that's missing? Because I think there's something really, really positive and enriching in that, as well as obviously challenging.
Gerry, thanks very much for those thoughts as well. I mean, it's just so much to reflect on in what everybody has said. I'm going to just highlight one or 2 points. There's a very lively conversation going on in the chat. I'm just going to say, put on notice, Vicky Gunn and Andrew Leach. I'm going to bring you in a few minutes' time. I'm going to summarise just a few comments that have been made, which we might attend to. I think everyone can access the chat and will have seen a lot of what's passing by. There's been quite a lot of conversation, obviously, about digital access and what that means, both in economic terms, in cultural terms, who really has access to it, whether we've become more inclusive or indeed not in those kinds of ways. But Vicky, I think a little way back, you raised issues about rural perspective. Perhaps it's easy, especially for those of us who find our living in the central belt, to start to think in an urban way. But you raised a question about rurality in the arts. I wonder if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask a little bit about that, or indeed anything else.
Yeah, I mean, looking at what is happening with the arts in places like Caithness, out of, say, the Life Arts Centre, it's clear that they're trying to manage this hybrid notion of, if you can't get in the building, we can at least create some kind of place. And at some point we might have two places, one that's real and one that's virtual. But that depends on an infrastructure. Now, the east coast of Scotland probably has a slightly better internet infrastructure. The west coast of Scotland, once you go pretty much north of Luss, it's really, really problematic. Yeah. And there are huge numbers of artists up the west coast, and trying to gather them together in virtual space is not easy, because quite a lot of them are out with a system where they can access that. Now, the obvious thing then would be to bring them into the college environment, but of course at the moment they can't even do that.
Absolutely. Again, thanks for raising that. I wonder if does anyone on the panel want to respond or comment further on that question?
Well, just to kind of anecdotally say why I picked up on that issue and would have mentioned it even if it hadn't already come up in the chat, is that I've been interviewing people. I've been fortunate to be able to carry on writing about the arts throughout the pandemic because of the way the Scotsman's handled it. And I've been interviewing people quite intensively during it. And several of the people I've interviewed are either artists or people with a strong interest in the arts, people who have written about the arts in the past, who have for various reasons acquired disabilities or become less mobile than they were, and who say that during this pandemic, they have felt more able to rejoin the conversation and more able to experience, cultural work alongside other people than they have for years. And they've also felt that the slowing down of the pace of everything has made it much, much more possible for people particularly with, sort of mobility problems or mental health problems to rejoin the conversation. So in a way, I'm just reporting that, but I think it's quite a widely reflected experience. It doesn't, of course, put to one side the problems of access for people who, for reasons of poverty, just don't have the same access to the internet, or perhaps because of reasons of geography. But I think there is quite a big constituency of people who were feeling excluded from the arts because of issues to do with actually getting to the physical place and finding the money to pay for the tickets, who have found certainly the initial phase of the lockdown quite including by comparison.
Yeah. Thanks, Joyce, for that. I mean, I think the questions of poverty and geography are going to be absolutely central moving forward, because clearly access is very, very uneven, and we will be moving into more of an online world one way or another, and the gap could grow even greater. So thanks, Vicky, for raising that question. Just a note in passing, before I bring Andrew Leach in, Craig Lundy's raised a couple of important points about the unimaginativeness of a lot of devolutionary spending on the arts, and also he notes the Scottish Arts Council has developed a culture of artists, he's put that in inverted commas, who pitch to what is expected to be acceptable by the averaging out of the council's board members. So that raises some interesting issues as well. Andrew Leach, do you want to come in with you've raised a number of questions. I don't know if you want to just briefly highlight a couple of them, and then we'll see if people want to have a chew on them.
It was really just a number of points. Obviously, the point raised by the previous speaker, the previous caller, who was talking about rural. I understand the digital reach in rural areas is challenging and continues to do so, but it should get better. But I can't really reconcile in my head how much easier it would be for someone to travel for many, many miles to a place to meet, because surely, if you think if it's a 2.5 hour drive, do they have a car? Can they afford the petrol? Are they physically able to get there? Are they an older person? Are they a person with disabilities? I mean, there is no easy answer to it. I completely agree, but digital infrastructure should get better, and a lot of people in Scotland can't access it. And the other thing about the internet is it's in relation to, I think, points of chat and point Joyce made about places and spaces, and thinking 64 people in a theatre is a good night, but then you push it out on the internet and you get 64,000 or 6,400. Surely that's better. And the other thing is, your reach is now global. It is not just Edinburgh. It's not just people that can drive into that theatre. It is global. The internet has flattened the world where Scottish product is now available. And we produce fantastic product. We have amazing artists all over Scotland. And this actually, in the flattened world, is the real opportunity for them to shine.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, again, interesting points. And I should add, while you were speaking, Simon Murray came in and said Highland Community Broadband is brilliant near Ullapool. So that's good to hear. Wanted to bring Ankna and Flavia in on this particular conversation, and particularly Ankna, I suppose. For those of us who are desperately missing live music and live concerts, it feels sometimes that what can be done online is valuable, but is a bit of a sort of poor substitute. I'm also thinking with Flavia about, theatre as well. I wonder if either or both of you wanted to comment on that question.
Ankna, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Flavs. I think listening to the conversations that have been had so far, while going online, definitely it is accessible to people. But I think when we talk about music online, personally, I am tired of listening to, attending concerts online. I am just tired. Because as a musician, I think it's different, because as a musician, I miss being in the space, in the room, making music real time or musicking. So that personally, I am definitely missing that. So I am now tired. At the beginning, it was great. Joyce also mentioned, at the beginning of lockdown, everybody was like, oh great, there's so many online things, but then everybody's wanting to be online. There is so much stuff. I have not stopped staring at a screen all day. But that's also because I'm doing the PhD, but I think I'm just tired of screen. I just want to go away from my screen. And I think just listening to Andrew and Craig, just the discussion in the chat, I think we need to talk about what Peter was talking about, the local. Why do people have to travel to 20 miles to get to a decent theatre? What do we mean in terms of being creative with local venues? What does that mean? Would that change access? Why isn't there more funding to then encourage people in these rural locations and areas that they can access art locally and not have to travel to Edinburgh or to Glasgow or to the big cities? So I think there's also a conversation about how money can be funded and how we can be creative with these spaces. And also somebody mentioned the word blending. Gosh, in higher education, that has been such an overkill with blended learning. But I think that can be exciting to use as an opportunity in these local spaces. Yeah, Flavia.
Thanks, Ankna. Flavia.
Thank you. There's a couple of things that occur to me there that I'm thinking about, that I worry about some certain assumptions there, because obviously we have, of course, to consider audiences and all that. But I'd like to speak from the perspective of an artist and from the perspective of what is termed a grassroots artist. So I think that one problem that we have as well is resources. So it's all fine and well for the EIF, for the National Theatre Scotland, for Perth, to be putting on big online shows because they've got the resources to do so. For the rest of us, what we're looking at, it's almost like the fringes are a bigger risk here, because, for example, I don't have the resources or the training to make online theatre. To give a concrete example, Jen McGregor got some funding for a show just before lockdown started that I was directing. So it was conceived as a live performance, but obviously we locked down, so we had to adapt to digital. But the funding we had was simply not enough for us to, and the time we had was not enough for the two of us to figure out how to make that transition to the online. So one is the artistic point that has bothered me this entire year, where I've been asking people, what is it that makes theatre theatre? What makes theatre look like theatre and not just a film or a YouTube video? So that is one of the things I've been thinking about. The other thing, like I said, is plainly the physical and technological resources. So, we didn't have a space, we didn't have a stage, we didn't have a workshop space that we could go to, or that we could work in to create a piece of digital theatre. Jen had enough funding to buy some equipment, but she had to teach herself how to use that. So, it's a completely different skill set. We're theatre makers, we're not filmmakers. And I think that there needs to be an understanding about that as well in this transition to either online or hybrid spaces, is that we haven't been given enough time and resources to learn how to do this. And that's one of the things that I would very much like to see more of. Is we've seen a few grants appearing here and there, a few support programs, but they're all attached to a brief or a specific commission, and you have to do this thing. But I would like to see some more resources available for artists to just spend some time figuring it out. How do we do this? Particularly people who are working at a small and medium scale like us, who don't have a whole team to do this.
Absolutely. Again, just following on from that and looking at what's happening in the chat, it's all happening far too quickly for me to summarize in any effective way, but I'm delighted to see that Anna Stewart has joined us, and has probably been here from the beginning, but Anna has a chapter in the book, a fabulous story called Blue Reflecting. So I'm going to just ask if you want to join us in a couple of moments, but looking, and also Karim Polwart has raising issues about the local. Again, I'll call you in a few moments, Karine. So I'm just looking to see if there are other things I can quickly pick up on that have rushed by. Yeah, again, more comments about digital access. And Jen McGregor made a point earlier about leadership is the job of every single leader in the arts. Any who don't see that as part of their role, from funding bodies to producing companies, should quit and make way for those who'll take it on. I expect there'll be a few volunteers for that as well. So, Anna, I wondered if you wanted to make a comment or ask a question. If you can unmute. Maybe there's a problem with that. Karine, do you want to come in at this point? You're raising some important issues about the local.
Hello.
Hi.
Hiya. Yeah, I'm partly backing up what Ankna was saying. As a musician, feeling quite frustrated by the digital realm at this point. I mean, it's been brilliant in some respects to be connected to people that you wouldn't otherwise have a chance to connect with, and there are ways to make it kind of humane and intimate and kind of bespoke, but it takes a lot of effort, and it does mean kind of restricting numbers. So I think the idea of scale and reach is, for me, slightly overrated. So the things that have been most meaningful are the intimate things. I mean, things like performing for people who are in palliative care, like into somebody's bedroom, you know, that those kind of things have been actually amazing, and they've always been technically possible, but hasn't been clear how possible that is to work in that kind of way. And I've been really moved by those kind of experiences. But the thing most of all has been actually doing stuff in my own home village. I live in a village just half an hour south of Edinburgh. There are a lot of musicians living in my community. About 20 musicians live here. And the most amazing things have been on street corners and in back gardens and through windows. You know, and these are artists that are working at many, many different levels, but, you know, this is artists that tour internationally, you know, hanging out on street corners and playing Cayley tunes in the street. And it's been beautiful, and has made me really think about the purpose of artists in the context of their own community and how to make that sustainable, because it's meaningful and beautiful and intimate, but it doesn't pay a penny. And I've no idea how to be an artist in my community in a way that's not extractive and exploitative, but is actually purposeful. Yeah. So there's a question in my head around that, around the wealth of artists that are currently, we are where we are in our, whether it's urban or rural communities, we are stuck where we are. But rather than viewing it as stuckness, what might it look like to actually be artists in and for and with your own place?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean the very personal, you know, performances in, you know, all kinds of local places is terrific. It's almost like the Tiny Desk concert going very local. But as you say, the question of how resources can support that is a real one. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any comment on that. I'm going to then bring Anna back in. Peter, great.
Oh yeah, so there's a couple of things. I think first of all, this is jumping back a bit, But I mean, as a playwright, this is a bit purely selfish point, but 64 people in the Traverse is 64 quid for me. 64,000 people on YouTube is nothing. It's no income at all. So again, I think that we are looking at much bigger questions about how we make this stuff happen for the benefit of local communities. And I think Corinne's point about those kind of magical moments of locality argues for reimagining a structure for the arts. But again, that then brings us back to leadership, to Joyce's point about leadership, because there's so many points that the people have been making, because who is going to do that? And the answer is nobody who's on a salary is going to do that until the salary vanishes. Now, I'm not suggesting the salary should vanish, but I am suggesting that a political decision to keep paying the salaries because it's easier than doing anything else is a political decision, and politics. And these are things for us to decide. So if we need a leadership within the arts that does respond to a well-being based, locally place-based idea of what the arts could contribute to a new Scotland 10 years from now, if we can say, okay, here's the vision 10 years from now, if we can get the vision together, there's lots of visionary people sitting around the chat room, on the panel and off it, get those people together and say, look, this is how you do it. It's not rocket science. We make an inquiry as to the needs and potential of every area in Scotland. What do you need? How much touring do you need? How much internet access do you have? All those kind of things. You put them all together and you then say, okay, here's the vision and here's how we structure funding it. And I think online is great, but and I don't think that anyone should be doing a show now without making a really broadcast standard video of that show. I think that's absolutely right. But you've got to absolutely think through everything before you can make it work. We've grown up with one way of doing things, which wasn't working fantastically well for everyone in the first place. But it's not going to work at all at the moment. At the moment, it's being held up. It's being propped up like a sick person in a bed, which is what it is. But and when we come out of this, we're going into a financial crisis. Yeah. And so if artists don't watch themselves, we're in such serious trouble that I don't think people are taking this nearly seriously enough. So there we are. That's my rant over.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I mean, a lot of that echoes back to a point that Jill Ebury made earlier in the chat about, can we use this time to rethink what we mean by arts and culture, to democratise it and so on. And yet we're also up against the threat of what might come at the other end as well. Okay, just to say that Anna has messaged to say that she's happy to listen, and she was wrestling with her mute button earlier, but can I really encourage you to read her story, Blue Reflecting, in the book. Who do I bring in next? Well, I think actually I want to pick up on things that both Gerry and Joyce said. They both used the C word, by which I mean class. And Gerry was talking about that specifically in relation to sport and culture and so on. It seems that at times like this, when resources are critical, politicians who are never normally interested in class when it comes to things like food poverty or disabled people or anything else like that will suddenly say, oh yes, the arts, that's for posh people and that's elitist and it doesn't need money and so on. What do we think are happening to those sorts of very stereotyped sort of responses? But undoubtedly it's often the arts and culture is low down the political pecking order. It can be kind of ignored or pushed away while other things are happening. What do we think about how to integrate that with the other really important changes that we need to make as we think about the virus? And if anyone's got any comments about the class issue and the money issue and so on.
Can I make a quick point then?
Yeah, come back on.
Somebody earlier said, and Peter sort of really in a way critiqued it in the particular, but someone said the world is flat. The world is not flat in any sense. That's the globalizing view of the world that ended up with Trump and Brexit and all that. Yes, it's great to be connected and all that, but Peter's point is people need to be funded. And also, while we want to be internationalist, we want to have a grounded relationship with where we are. You know, that point, when I see my hometown on that BBC series Traces, I think of all the many years I've not seen all the other towns and communities of Scotland. And I think a lot of what we're talking about are bigger issues about Scotland and bigger issues about the world and how they relate back to arts and culture. Somebody's used the phrase toffification of culture that we've lived through in Britain. And it was Anna Stewart made the point in the chat room about it's Warwick University research that, 8%, the most 8% affluent, educated people in Britain are the people that are most culturally active. The arts are not this great democratizing community, because how can they be when Britain's the most unequal developed country in the world? Look who's missing, look who's missing in Scotland, something we never really, look upon, except in an independence referendum. So that point really bulks. I really get annoyed at when we think we're this great inclusive country.
Yes, Gerry, says Flavia, emphatically in response to that. Thank you. And Craig Lundy's continued to make a number of interesting points. And he's just said, if we could democratize knowledge of basic, coding and markup and the other skills that you need, the next industrial artistic revolution can happen. And the state which does this collectively will lead the future. There's a interesting and challenging point. Meanwhile, I have heard from Anna that she's sorted out the problem with her mute button. And we'd love to hear from you, Anna. We hang on the edge of anticipation here. Maybe the technical problem hasn't been quite resolved.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, I was saying, oh no, sorry. I don't know what's happened with this this thing. It's been such an interesting conversation so far, and I noticed within the chat that my former the director of theatre at Dartington, Simon Murray, is also watching this today, and it made me think about why I ended up writing short stories as opposed to doing theatre, because I studied theatre years ago. I went down to Devon and studied there all the way from Dundee, 12 hours on that train to get down to Dartington. And I was young and fresh-faced, and it was a really interesting experience for me, because coming sort of from a working class city, Dundee, and then going to this place, and there was a lot of young people there who maybe didn't have similar worries financially to me as well, and things like that. But when I moved back to Scotland, I ended up studying writing after working for a few years doing various different jobs. But one of the reasons I ended up writing on the page was because I knew that I would need to have money to be able to do this devised theatre that I sort of was so passionate about after studying at Dartington. And I thought, for me to actually create something that is in my mind and to be creative, I'm just going to have to write it down. That's all I can do. And I can't even imagine that it'll even go anywhere, In London, I put on a little play. I wrote this little play and I put it on at the Pleasance Theatre. And I was just really lucky that I had put the script in. And they said, oh, yeah, you can put that on for a couple of nights. They very kindly let me put it on. And but I realised even doing that, I needed money to be able to do theatre. And I'm dyslexic as well, so I wasn't going to be able to fill in any of those forms. So for me, just writing. That's the only thing that I can do where I can sort of express myself creatively.
We're very glad you have, and thanks very much for sharing part of that story, which links together in a very practical sense a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and it's sort of finding ways for people to be able to access the arts without it having to involve them maybe as a sort of profession as well, so that they can still work, have a job, and so that there are spaces for people like who are working and who maybe don't have a lot of money to express themselves creatively. I'm sorry if my mic was now really loud.
Thank you very much for that. Well, look, folks, I hate to say this, but we're coming fairly close to the end now. It's been a very rich discussion, both with the panel and also what people have contributed, and the chat, which is incredibly lively. And I'm certainly going to be saving the chat because I think there's just so much to reflect on from there. But what I guess I want to do with the panel is just give people a chance for any final comments they want to make here. I'll bring Gerry in last. But perhaps, Flavia, shall I start with you? If there's anything, I know you made a comment in the chat.
I've made all the comments in the chat.
Yeah, but if there's something you wanted to pick up.
Yeah, no, the couple of things that I wanted to say earlier was what Corinne said as well, that there is this assumption as well that bigger is better, and not all theatre fits a big stage, not all theatre suits a big stage and a big auditorium. And I personally got into theatre in the first place because I like the direct contact with the audience one way or another. So, I haven't figured out what is a good way of keeping that sense of intimacy with the audience in this medium yet, even though interaction is possible, but interaction and intimacy are not the same thing. And the other thing is that I was asking there if anyone had any data on the online audiences, on the demographic of the online audiences, because I would like to know if we're not simply repeating the pattern that I see in live theatre of making theatre for theatre makers. And mentioned attending a performance at the Tron that was sold out, but I knew every single person in the audience, and that made me sad. So it would be interesting to find out who the online audiences are, and if we are getting regular punters and not just people who are connected already with theatre and the arts anyway.
Yeah, thanks very much. Agner, any final thought from you?
I'm just thinking of instead of reacting, I think there's just so much to think about here. Some very interesting points. The question that Corinne asked. By the way, I love your voice, Corinne. I'm just gonna fangirl a little bit. But I think the question that you asked about how do we bring these two worlds of where you're performing on a stage, and that I mean, for a singer that's a livelihood, and bringing this intimacy, and how are we able to kind of bring them closer to each other, even if not, but at least on the same platform. And it's just I think that also comes down to the point about what value the arts has in the government's list of priorities, and it's clearly really low. If it still is on the list, I think it is very, very low. So I think I'm just going to take away with me what role I can play, especially in higher music education and higher performing arts education. What role do the conservatoires and these institutions have in terms of making this community realize the true value of arts? But I don't think that will be possible until there is government backing to it. Yeah, so not really to add, but kind of summarize what I'm.
No, that's very helpful, and it's certainly, I think, something we're all agreed on that we need to really shout about and combat, some of the complacency or indeed deliberate underfunding of the arts as well. I'm going to bring in Peter next for his final thought, and then Joyce, just to warn her. So Peter.
There are two things I want to pick up. First of all, is the point that Agner just made about education institutions. The thing is, I think artists are usually multi-skilled. We can teach, we can lead workshops, we can do all kinds of things. we can be much more integrated into the way that the fabric of local community than we are, because we lean everything towards funding bodies which are all in Edinburgh and say, okay, that's the way you make a living. Actually, there are many more flexible ways for artists to make a living. And on the online thing, I've been watching Celtic Connections, and I paid for my big ticket, which gives me access to all these acts which I would never normally go to see. So partly I would agree with Joyce that it does give you, even someone like who goes to see things like I do, it gives you access to many more things. But again, and I think but their package, the fact that you're buying access to 40 artists is possibly a model we can work with, as opposed to a model to say, because if I put my stuff on YouTube, it's not going to work. You know what I mean? So, but if me and every other Scottish playwright have all our stuff on YouTube, people might subscribe to that channel, maybe.
There we go. Thanks, Peter. Joyce, any final comment from you? Joyce is just reconnecting. I think while she's doing that, I might just bring Gerry in.
No, there we go.
Oh no, here she is. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I kind of make my living seeing the big picture of things, but the picture of the impact of this on the arts, I think, is so big that I really just can't see it all yet. It's extremely complicated. I mean, for instance, somebody in the chat here, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten who it was, mentioned, what about universal basic income? Wouldn't that make a difference? Well, of course, if we move post-COVID into a world where there is anything resembling universal basic income, that will change everything in terms of arts funding, because it means that people at the grassroots who want to be artists will have at least enough resource to live on to begin to shape the arts in their communities the way they want them to be. And that would change everything. It would shift the balance of power in terms of who has the time and the space to create art. And people would stop having to stand in a queue for the gatekeepers of arts funding, whether the big arts organisations or the funding bodies themselves. So that would change everything. And yet we have no idea whether or how much that is ever likely to happen. What I would say as a note of warning, because of some of this discussion has been talking as if we don't have anything, as if we don't have public support for the arts. If we do, it's all going to the wrong places. Nobody's doing these sort of community things very systematically or well. And a lot of that is true. And there's a huge amount to criticise. But I think before we go for kind of knocking all the pins out of what's happening in the arts world, we do need to look at what we do have and at the good practice where it happens. I mean, for instance, the Scottish government funding for big Scottish arts venues came with an absolute demand that they deliver a certain proportion of that to freelancers working in the arts, and they have done. You know, the things that they've done. For instance, the NTS programme, which didn't need government funding, has employed, I think, well over 100, something like 120, 150 freelance artists in that programme. So, you know, be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There actually is quite a lot of arts funding. It's been well sustained by the Scottish Government in this crisis. And of course, there are problems about where it goes and how it's distributed. But, you know, bear in mind that there is a lot of arts funding there, and that if the problem is one of distribution, we should address that and not constantly be attacking governments for not funding the arts at all. Just that my last point really is that I think we have to, I love Gerry's image of seeing his city of Dundee on the screen and seeing it transformed by that perspective, because I think that captures something about the relationship between the local and the global that is really going to have to be a watchword for us. You know, if we've got Karine, a great singer, you know, in her back garden in Pathhead, doing her thing, and learning again how to reconnect arts into a community in the way that people did maybe before there was such a thing as the professional arts, then how do we, while rededicating ourselves to that experience, take that into a world which will on some terms or other, remain globalized. When Gerry sees Dundee on screen, it's not just that it's Dundee, it's not just that it's rooted in the reality of that city, but it's also that a whole world of eyes are looking at it, and so it's local experience made global and shared, and that's what's really magical about the arts. You know, that link between the very, very intimate personal experience and something that was shared by the whole of humanity in some cases. So, you know, we don't want to lose that. We rededicate ourselves to the local, but in a context that is global, and that we'll be finding new ways of articulating that globalness that none of us have ever thought of yet.
Thank you very much for that thought, Joyce. Gerry, do you want to have a final word on this before we wrap up?
Thank you for that wonderful point, Joyce. That really makes me pause and think. Two quick points really. One is that everything we've talked about, what is underlying it, what is pushing it in the wrong direction before COVID and will do after COVID, is the economy. And what we've ended up with, and that lots of us have been worried about for years, is arts and culture used as funding, as activity, merely as an adjunct and an extension of economic policy and of bankrupt economic ideology. So we've had things, global ideas that began in Britain and America that have gone out to the world, of culture as creative class, culture as the creativity of the winners in the global economy. Thus, that's where the idea of Creative Scotland came from. And we really need to think about arts and culture in the context of how do we remake it that it isn't connected to that bankrupt version of the economy? Because make no mistake, post-COVID, that version of the economy isn't going away, isn't going to apologise and retreat. It's going to be retrenching and trying to cannibalise and kind of colonise us. And as we all know, it's an unsustainable, unequitable, inhumane model of the world in which Britain is one of the leading advocates in the world, and it uses our culture.
Yeah, absolutely, Gerry. Your co-editors heartily agreeing with you on that. I'm very glad that we got to the point at the end also about universal basic income, and I would add universal basic services. I mean, I think that is coming onto the political agenda as never before. It's huge resistance to it. But I think the important point to make, and it's particularly pertinent in terms of the arts, is that actually it's an investment. Yes, it is public money being spent, but it's public money which goes into people's pockets that can be spent, that can help regenerate communities and so on. So we need to think of it as an investment, not as a drag or as a cost. On that point, I really want to thank everybody who's taken part in tonight, particularly our speakers, but everyone who's been involved in the chat, who's made contributions at different points. We have a small reward for you, which is that if you would like to buy a copy of Scotland After the Virus, it's available through the Luath site. The web address is actually put into chat, www.luath.co.uk, and then you can look for the book. Use the code SATSocial to get £2.99 off the book. So I hope that that's a welcome thing. And the very last thing I wanted to say was actually to thank everyone at Luath. We ought to note that we did receive some support through the Barry Amiel and Norman Melbourne Trust, and from Creative Scotland as well. It's not that anyone's made a lot out of this book, but it's enabled it to happen, and events like this as well. And I'd like to thank personally, and so would Gerry, everyone at Luath Press, Gavin McDougall, Carrie Hutchinson, Lauren Grieve, Daniel Meal and Jenny Renton. You're marvellous, and we're delighted to have this book with you. And we hope the conversation that it's stoked this evening can go on in many different forms. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a really good rest of the evening.
I don't think people want to leave.
No. Since we don't have a bar, we can just go to Twitter now, right?
Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, we don't have a bar. Thanks very much, everyone. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Simon, as well for your hosting as well.